Hello, Namaste and welcome you all. In our last lecture, we have discussed what is mean by PV ratio and what PV ratio tells us we discussed in the last lecture. As we discussed in the last lecture, PV ratio tells us that suppose PV ratio is 60%, that is contribution to sales ratio is suppose 60%, it means contribution is 60% of sales, and it means fixed cost is 60% of BP sales, and it means profit is 60% of margin of safety sales, as we discussed in the last lecture. And today what we are going to discuss? Today we are going to understand one alternative method to calculate the PV ratio, and mainly we are going to understand the correlationship between sales, contribution and PV ratio with the help of one practical example. So let's start. In our example, per unit selling price means selling price of 1 unit is rupees 10. Per unit variable cost, that is variable cost of one or single unit, which is rupees 9. And as we know, contribution means sales less variable cost, the remaining amount called as contribution. So what will be the per unit contribution? So per unit contribution is equal to per unit selling price, which is rupees 10, less per unit variable cost, which is rupees 9. So per unit contribution will be per unit selling price 10 less per unit variable cost 9. So per unit contribution will be rupee 1. Rupee 1 will be the per unit contribution. Then what will be the PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio? How to calculate it, as we discussed in the last lecture. Contribution upon sales into 100 is equal to PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio or contribution ratio or marginal ratio. So PV ratio will be per unit contribution, which is rupee 1, per unit contribution upon per unit selling price, which is rupees 10. So per unit contribution 1, per unit selling price 10, 1 upon 10 into 100, then 10% will be the PV ratio. PV ratio will be 10%. PV ratio is also called as contribution to sales ratio or contribution ratio or marginal ratio. And what it means? PV ratio is 10%. It means contribution to sales ratio is 10%. It means contribution is 10% of sales. It means fixed cost is 10% of BP sales, and it means profit is 10% of margin of safety sales. So with the help of this table, now we are going to understand the correlation between the sales, contribution and PV ratio. So let's start our analysis of correlation. First column of the table shows sales units. Second column shows sales in rupees. Third column shows total variable cost. How to calculate the same? Number of units into per unit variable cost. Then we get the amount of total variable cost. Then fourth column shows amount of contribution. As we know how to calculate the contribution, sales less variable cost. So sales less variable cost, amount will be contribution. The last column shows PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio. How to calculate the same? As we know, contribution upon sales into 100. Then we will get the percentage of PV ratio. So let's start. Suppose we have sold 1 unit. Sales units 1. Selling price 10. So 1 into 10. Units 1, selling price 10. Then amount of sales will be rupees 10. What will be the amount of total variable cost? Number of units 1. Per unit variable cost 9. 1 into 9. Total variable cost will be rupees 9. Then what will be the amount of contribution? Contribution is equal to sales less variable cost. Sales 10 less variable cost 9. Contribution amount will be rupee 1. Then what will be the PV ratio? PV ratio is equal to contribution upon sales into 100. Here contribution is rupee 1 upon sales, which is rupees 10. 1 upon 10 into 100 is equal to 10% is a PV ratio. And suppose we have sold 10 units. Then what will be the amount of sales? Number of units sold 10 into per unit selling price, which is also 10. 10 into 10 total 100 is the amount of total sales. What will be the amount of total variable cost? Number of units 10. Per unit variable cost, which is 9. 10 into 9, 90 will be the total variable cost. Then what will be the amount of contribution? Contribution is equal to sales less variable cost. So sales 100 less variable cost 90, then contribution will be rupees 10. Then what will be the PV ratio? PV ratio, as we know, the ratio of contribution to sales. So contribution upon sales into 100. Here contribution is rupees 10. That's why we have taken 10 upon sales. Sales, which is rupees 100. 10 upon 100 into 100 is equal to 10%. Again PV ratio came 10%. Then suppose we have sold 20 units. What will be the amount of sales? 20 units. Units into selling price. Units 20, per unit selling price 10. 20 into 10 to total 200 will be the amount of sales. Then what will be the amount of total variable cost? Number of units into per unit variable cost. Number of units 20, per unit variable cost, which is 9. 20 into 9 is equal to 180 will be the amount of total variable cost. Then what will be contribution? As we know, contribution is equal to sales less variable cost. So sales, which is 200 less total variable cost 180. So remaining 20 will be the amount of contribution. Then what will be the contribution to sales ratio or PV ratio? PV ratio is equal to contribution upon sales into 100. Contribution 20 upon 200, sales 20 upon 200 into 100. Then PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is again 10%. If you observe this table, what you realize? You can see, if you are increasing sales, your amount of contribution is also increasing. If you are decreasing sales, your amount of contribution is also decreasing. And this increase and decrease is also proportionately. You can see, if you increase sales by 10 times, 100 is 10 times of 10. If you increase sales by 10 times, your contribution also increases by 10 times. 10 is 10 times of 10. Then, 10 is 10 times of 1. Then you can see, if you decrease sales by 50%, 100 is 50% of 200. If you decrease sales by 50%, your contribution also get decreased by 50%. 10 is 50% of 20. Means what? Contribution has positive relation with sales. Contribution has positive relation with sales. Why? If you increase sales by 10%, your contribution will also increase by 10%. If you decrease sales by 10%, your contribution will also decrease by same, that is 10%. Okay. Means suppose your sales is increased by 95%, then contribution will also increase by 95, same percentage. If you decrease sales by 95%, your contribution will also decrease by same 95%. That is called as positive relation. So you can see your sales and contribution has positive relation. Contribution has positive relation with sales. Another one thing you can observe. You are increasing sales from 1 to 10 units, from 10 units to 20 units, but even though your PV ratio, that is contribution to sales ratio, is 10, which is constant, which is unchanged. Why it happens? You can see whether you are increasing sales or decreasing sales, your PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio remains unchanged or constant. So question is that why it happens? Because PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio is neutral. It doesn't react to the changes in the sales. Means whether you increase the sales or decrease the sales, PV ratio or contribution to sales ratio will remain unchanged. And why it happens? Because your contribution percentage is unchanged. You can see your selling price, which is 10 per unit, variable cost which is 9. So selling price 10 per unit, contribution 1, PV ratio is 10%. Means why it is unchanged? Whether you are increasing sales or decreasing sale, at all levels, what is your selling price? 10. At all levels. What is your per unit variable cost? 9. At all levels. So at all levels, 10 less 9 is equal to 1, and that 1 is 10%. 1 is 10% of total sale, that is 10. You can see your contribution is always 10% of sales. You can see 1 is 10% of 10 sales. 10 is 10, that is contribution, is 10% of 100, that is sales. Here also your contribution 20 is 10% of 200 sales. Why it happens? Because throughout all levels your selling price is unchanged. Selling price is same and variable cost is also same, which is 9. At all levels your selling price is per unit, selling price is 10, your per unit variable cost is 9. So difference between these 10 less 9 is equal to 1 is contribution. That contribution is 10% of selling price. Per unit contribution is 10% of per unit selling price, and that contribution ratio has been maintained continuously throughout all levels. That's why at all levels your contribution is 10% of sales, and the same thing PV ratio shows. PV ratio shows that your contribution is 10% of sales. Contribution is 10%, PV ratio is 10% means what? It means contribution is 10% of sales. Same fact PV ratio is showing. That's why your PV ratio is constant throughout all levels of sales. Why it is constant? Because your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost are constant, unchanged throughout all levels. That's why your PV ratio, original PV ratio, was also remain constant at all levels, which remains same, that is which remain 10%. Why? Because at all levels your per unit selling price and your per unit variable cost is unchanged at all levels. That's why the same PV ratio 10% will also remain unchanged or will also remain same. That's why whether you increase the production or decrease the production, your PV ratio remain same. What is the reason behind? Because your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost not change. Means what we can say? if you make no change, if you make no change in per unit variable cost and per unit selling price, then your PV ratio will also not change. Means if your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost is unchanged, then your PV ratio will also remain unchanged. No change in selling price, per unit selling price and per unit variable cost. So there will be no change in PV ratio also. Means if your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost if remain unchanged throughout all levels of sales, then your PV ratio will also remain unchanged throughout all levels of sales. Because there is one assumption in marginal costing technique. What is that assumption? As in marginal costing technique, it is assumed that per unit selling price and per unit variable cost will not change throughout all levels of sales. If these will not change, contribution percentage, that is PV ratio, also will not change, and that's why PV ratio will remain unchanged throughout all levels of sales. So means PV ratio will not change at all. It will change. PV ratio can be changed. PV ratio can be changed, but only when if you make change in any one of these variables. If you make change in per unit selling price, or if you make change in per unit variable cost, then not total variable cost, per unit variable cost. If you make change in per unit selling price or per unit variable cost, only then your PV ratio will change. When PV ratio will change? If you make change in any of these two variables. If you make change in per unit selling price, or if you make change in per unit variable cost, not total variable cost, per unit variable, only then your PV ratio will change. How? Now we are going to discuss. Suppose instead of per unit variable cost 9, suppose new variable cost, new revised variable cost, suppose rupees 8. Then what will be your contribution? Per unit contribution will be per unit selling price, which is same 10 less per unit variable cost, revised 8. So 10 less 8. Your per unit contribution will be rupees 2. Per unit contribution will be now 2, because your new revised price, suppose rupees 8. Revised per unit variable cost is suppose rupees 8. So selling price 10 less per unit revised selling per unit variable cost, revised 8. So 10 less 8, 2 will be your per unit revised contribution. So what will be your revised PV ratio? Per unit contribution 2 upon per unit selling price, 2 upon 10 into 100, 20% will be the PV ratio. Previous PV ratio was 10%. It got changed to 20%. Why PV ratio got changed? Because of we make change in per unit variable cost. That's why your PV ratio was changed. Previous PV ratio was 10%. Now it is 20%. Same thing happens if you make change in per unit selling price. How? You can see. Suppose you make change in selling price. Instead of selling price rupees 10, suppose your new or revised selling price is 18. If your revised selling price is 18, so selling price 18 revised less per unit variable cost, suppose which is 9, same. So 18 less 9. So 9 is equal to remaining amount is 9. That means your revised contribution will be 9. So what will be your revised PV ratio? Per unit contribution upon per unit sales. Revised contribution 9 upon revised contribution is 9 upon 18 new selling price. Okay, 9 upon 18 into 100. So 50% will be your PV ratio. We make change in selling price. Instead of 10, new selling price is suppose 18. Variable cost is same, not change. So 18 new price less original 9 per unit variable cost. So 18 less variable cost 9. 9 will be per unit contribution. So per unit contribution 9 upon 18 revised selling price. So 9 upon 18 into 100. So 50% will be the new PV ratio. What we have discussed? PV ratio will remain unchanged. PV ratio will not change if you make no change in per unit selling price and per unit variable cost. Means it is impossible to change PV ratio without making change in any of these two variables. In short, PV ratio cannot be changed. It will remain unchanged if you make no change in per unit selling price and per unit variable cost. Means if your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost if remain unchanged, then your PV ratio will also remain unchanged. But if you make change in any one of these variable, either in per unit variable cost or in per unit selling price, then your PV ratio will change. As we have seen, when we made change in per unit variable cost, instead of 9, if we took new variable cost 8, then our PV ratio got changed to 20%. We have also seen that if we make change in selling price, suppose instead of 10, we have taken new per unit selling price 18. So 18 selling price less original 9 variable cost, so 9 is contribution. So contribution 9 upon new selling price 18, we have changed. 9 upon 18, 100. So 50% is a new PV ratio. Means if you make change in per unit variable cost or per unit selling price, then only your PV ratio change. In short, if your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost is unchanged, then your PV ratio will also remain unchanged. But if you make change in per unit selling price or per unit variable cost, then your PV ratio will change. Means if you make change in any of these two, PV ratio will also change. If no change in these two, PV ratio will also not changed. Now, up to this stage, what we have discussed? We have discussed that contribution has positive relation with sales. Means if sales is increased by 10%, contribution will also increase by same 10%. If your sales is decreased by 10%, your contribution will also decrease by same percentage, that is by 10%. That is called as contribution has positive relation with sales. What second thing we discussed? We discussed that if you make no change in per unit selling price and per unit variable cost, then your PV ratio will not change. It will remain same or constant or unchanged. But if you make change in per unit selling price or per unit variable cost, then your PV ratio will get changed. These things we discuss up to this stage. Now we are going to discuss new alternative way to calculate the PV ratio, which is that now we are going to discuss PV ratio is equal to change in contribution upon change in sales into 100. Why this formula is of this way? Because whether you take total figures or changing figures, your proportion between contribution and sales will remain same, because your contribution PV ratio, contribution at all level is 10% of sales, because your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost is not changed. Your variable cost 9 is 90% of your selling price. 9 is 90% of 10. So at all levels your selling price is 10. At all levels your variable cost is also variable cost is 9, which is unchanged. That's why same proportion at all levels you can see variable cost is 90%. 9 is 90% of 10. 90 is 90% of 100. 180 is 90% of total sales. So this difference, if sales is 100%, less variable cost 90%, so remaining 10% is a contribution. So whether you make change, that change will also be 10% of sales. That's why it happens. That's why this formula is of that way. Now we are going to understand this alternative way. PV ratio is equal to change in contribution upon change in sales. Now we are going to take first change. Your first contribution was rupee 1. It was changed to 10. Means contribution is changed by rupees 9. Contribution is increased by rupees 9. So change in contribution is rupees 9. That's why change in contribution we have taken 9. Upon change in sales, your sales was 10. It was increased to 100. It is increased by rupees 90. Sales is changed by rupees 90. That's why we have taken 90. 9 upon 90. Say contribution increased by 9. Sales increased by 90. So 9 upon 90 into 100 is equal to 10%. You can see PV ratio is constant. Previously also PV ratio was 10%. Now also PV ratio is 10%. Means whether you take total amounts of contribution and sales, your PV ratio will remain same. Whether you consider changing figures of sales and contribution, even though your PV ratio will remain same, because at all levels your per unit selling price and per unit variable cost remain unchanged. Unless and until you make change in these two items, your PV ratio will not change. If you make change in these two, then only your PV ratio will change. Otherwise, it will not change. PV ratio will not change if you make no change in these two items. If you make change in per unit selling price and per unit variable cost, only then your PV ratio will change. Otherwise, means if you make no change in any one of these two, PV ratio will also not change. If you make change, it will change. If you make no change, it will not change. So as we discuss PV ratio, now we are considering second change. PV ratio is equal to change in contribution upon change in sales. Now second change, contribution was 10, it was increased to 20. So contribution changed by 10, increased by 10. That's why we have taken 10. Sales increased from 100 to 200. So it is increased by 100 or changed by 100. That's why we have taken 100. Change in sales 100. Change in contribution by 10. We have taken 10. Change in sales by 100. That's why we have taken 100. 10 change in contribution upon change in sales 100 into 100. So PV ratio is now same 10%. Now we are considering third change from first stage to third stage. Our contribution was 1, which was increased to 20. It is increased by rupees 19. So contribution is changed by rupees 19. That's why we have taken change in contribution 90. It was 1, it was changed to 20. It is increased or changed by 19. That's why we have taken 19. Upon sales was 10, it was increased to 200. It is increased by rupees 190 or it is changed by rupees 190. That's why we have taken 190 change in sales. 19 upon 190 into 100. So PV ratio became 10%. Same. You can see whether we take total amounts of sales and contribution or changing amount of sales and contribution, our PV ratio will remain unchanged. we can see our PV ratio 10%, 10%, 10%. At changing figures also PV ratio is 10%, 10%, 10%. Why it happens? Because our per unit selling price and per unit selling price was same, 10 at all levels. Per unit variable cost was 9 at all levels. So per unit selling price and per unit variable costs were unchanged. That's why PV ratio remained unchanged. We have not changed selling price or per unit variable cost at all levels. At all levels our selling price was 10. At all levels our variable cost was 9. That's why we have not made change in selling per unit selling price and per unit variable cost. That's why our PV ratio remained unchanged. So what we have discussed? First, we have discussed contribution as positive relation with sales. If you increase sales by 10%, your contribution will also increase by same 10%. If you decrease sales by 10%, your contribution will also decrease by same 10%. That's why contribution has positive relation with sales. What second thing we discuss? PV ratio. If you make no change in per unit selling price or per unit variable cost, if there is no change in any one of these two variables, your PV ratio will also not change. Means if these two remain unchanged, then your PV ratio will remain unchanged. As we discussed, we have not changed selling price and per unit variable cost at all levels. These were unchanged. That's why our PV ratio remained unchanged, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. When PV ratio can be changed? Only when PV ratio will change? If you make change in either in per unit variable cost or per unit selling price. Only then your PV ratio will change. So I hope all of you understood it. Thank you.